Welcome to the Withered Ledger, where every page is inked with whispers from the darker corners of history. Tell me if a stranger stood before you in the glow of a single lantern, his eyes calm, his voice warm and rich with promise, and he swore he could lift the burdens that had plagued your soul for years. Would you turn away, or would you listen? In the summer of 1864, the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia was already a land scorched by two fires, the unrelenting sun, and the endless civil war that bled its fields dry. Villages lay hollowed, their people worn thin by hunger, grief, and fear. And into this weary land came a man named Ezekiel Moore, a preacher without a past, carrying only a worn Bible and a voice that could still the restless or stir the fevered. They said his midnight sermons could heal the sick, ease the minds of the sleepless, even restore the will to live. But some claim those same words could creep into the corners of a man's thoughts until they no longer belonged to him at all. Tonight, we turn the page and follow the whispers into the fevered sermons of Shenandoah Hollow. The summer of 1864 lay heavy upon the Shenandoah Valley, its air thick with the scent of dust, gunpowder, and sweat. The land seemed to shimmer beneath an unforgiving sun, as if the very earth was fevered. War had made the fields barren and the people hollow. Farms were abandoned, their gates hanging by rusted hinges. Whole families had vanished overnight, swallowed by the front lines or fleeing to places where the sound of cannon fire didn't roll over the hills like distant thunder. Roads that once carried wagons laden with corn and apples now bore only soldiers, sometimes in neat columns, more often in scattered bands, hungry and worn. The uniforms blurred into one another. Some wore the gray of the Confederacy, others the blue of the Union, but all looked the same in the way their shoulders stooped, and their eyes stared at nothing. Shenandoah Hollow, a small settlement tucked between sloping hills and a winding creek, was not untouched. Its few remaining residents moved with the slow caution of those who expected danger at every turn. The air itself seemed to carry a weight, as though the valley had been holding its breath for too long. It was in this sweltering, war-torn landscape that Ezekiel Moore appeared. No one saw him arrive. Some claimed they noticed a figure walking the ridge road just after dawn, a tall man with a broad-brimmed hat casting a shadow over his eyes. Others swore he had been in the settlement for days, quietly observing before making himself known. However he came, by the time the sun slid westward that first day, the townsfolk had seen him, and they did not forget. Ezekiel stood tall, with the kind of posture that made him seem more like a pillar than a man. His clothes were simple but clean, his coat long and dark despite the heat. When he spoke, it was with a calm, measured tone that carried without strain, as though each word had been chosen with care and carved from stone before being placed into the air. His eyes were the strangest thing, not cold, not warm, but fixed in a way that made you feel they could see straight through the dust and sweat and exhaustion to whatever was buried deepest in you. By evening, a small crowd had gathered in the frame of an unfinished building on the edge of town, a shell of a church, its roof half covered in warped shingles, its floorboards uneven. War had halted its construction years ago, yet now its skeletal walls would serve a purpose. Ezekiel stood at the front, the late sun slicing through gaps in the boards, casting strips of light across his face. He opened a worn leather Bible and began to read. The verses were familiar, but he bent them, weaving them with strange images and parables none had heard before. He spoke of rivers running backward, of wheat fields that sang, of a great fire that did not burn but cleansed. The effect was immediate. People leaned forward, their breathing slowing, heads tilted slightly as though straining to catch every syllable. Even the children, fidgeting in the heat, fell still. It wasn't just what he said. It was how he said it, the rhythm that made the words flow like a slow river, each phrase lapping gently at the mind until the listener drifted without realizing. Among the gathered was Dr. James Carter. He had arrived in Shenandoah Hollow that same morning, having left the chaos of a field hospital to towns over. His mission was simple: tend to the sick, bind the wounds the war had left behind. He was a man of medicine, trained to trust observation over faith, and though he had seen enough horror to understand why some clung to scripture, He had never been swayed by words alone. Yet as he stood at the back of the church's skeletal frame, Carter felt something unfamiliar, a subtle pressure at the edges of his thoughts, as though the preacher's voice was not merely sound but a presence, a current pulling him forward. He resisted, shifting his stance, focusing on the faces around him. He noticed the expressions first, eyes slightly widened, mouths parted just enough for shallow breaths to slip through. It was the look he had seen in fevered patience, a kind of surrender, a quieting of will. But here, it was not fever that caused it, it was the preacher. Ezekiel closed his Bible without looking down, the pages falling shut as if the book itself obeyed him. He began to speak of the valley's suffering, the withering crops, the aching bodies. His words painted a picture of deliverance, of a night where no one feared the sound of boots on the road, of a dawn where the air itself felt lighter. When he finally stepped down, the people moved as if waking from a deep rest. Some touched their faces, others simply stood, reluctant to leave. Carter remained still, his mind turning. He told himself it was exhaustion, the heat, the collective yearning of the townsfolk that had made them so receptive. And yet, a part of him, the part that had felt that strange current, was not convinced. Outside, the sun dipped behind the hills and a wind rose, carrying with it the scent of pine and something else, something faint and sweet, like the trace of incense after a service. Ezekiel spoke quietly to a few villagers, placing a hand on their shoulders, his words low and private. Each person he touched seemed to leave with a softened face, as if some burden had been lifted in that instant. Carter walked away, his bag heavy at his side, but his thoughts heavier still. He had seen healers before, men who claimed divine inspiration, women who swore by charms and roots. But there was something about Ezekiel Moore that did not fit neatly into any of those boxes. And though Carter would never admit it, not then, not ever, there was a moment, just before he turned the corner and left the half-built church behind, when he realized he had slowed his step, straining to catch one last thread of that voice before it vanished into the coming night. The war was still raging beyond the valley, but here, in Shenandoah Hollow, another battle was beginning, one that would not be fought with rifles or bayonets, but with words. It began so quietly that most in Shenandoah Hollow did not even notice the moment it started. A whisper, a suggestion, passed from one parched mouth to another like the last sip of water in a drought. 2 days after Ezekiel Moore had first filled the makeshift church with his voice, some of the townsfolk began to speak of another gathering. Not on Sunday morning, when hymns and scripture were expected. Not in the forgiving light of day. No, this would take place at midnight, for those burdened by the war's ghosts. As Ezekiel himself was said to have whispered to a chosen few. No written notice appeared on the tavern wall, no bell rang from the steeple frame. The invitation traveled along the unpaved lanes in murmurs and side glances, shared in the pause between transactions at the market, or as neighbors leaned across fence rails under the pale heat of late afternoon. Those who received it reacted in quiet ways, a tightened jaw, a far-off look, a nod as if they had been waiting for this without knowing why. On the night itself, the town seemed to hold its breath. Carter had been in his rented room at the boarding house, making notes by lamplight on the fevers and infections he had treated that week. A faint movement beyond the warped glass of his window caught his attention. In the dim moonlight, silhouettes moved along the main road, some alone, some in pairs, all walking with a peculiar deliberation, neither hurried nor hesitant. They carried no lanterns, letting the cold silver light guide their steps. Curiosity tugged at him. The war had filled the valley with enough strange sights that he'd learned not to ignore them. He set aside his notes, pulled on his coat, and slipped outside, keeping to the shadows so as not to draw attention. The church, still little more than four walls and a roof without a steeple, glowed faintly ahead. Yet this was not the familiar orange flicker of lanterns. As Carter drew closer, he saw that shallow bowls of oil had been placed along the inside perimeter, each holding a slow-burning wick. The flames were small, low to the ground, their light-breathing shadows up the rough timber walls. Inside, the air was thick and carried a sweet, almost medicinal scent. It was faint enough to be overlooked, yet distinct enough to be noticed. Something floral, but sharpened by an undertone he could not place. It was not the scent of the pines outside, nor the soap the women made in iron pots. This was something. Curated. Ezekiel Moore stood at the front, but unlike his earlier sermon, he was without the black-bound Bible. His hands were open at his sides, palms facing the congregation, as if inviting them into a confidence to intimate for Scripture. His voice was low, so low that Carter wondered how the villagers could hear him from the back rows, yet every face was turned toward him, every eye fixed with unblinking attention. "Close your eyes," Ezekiel murmured. "Let the night become your shelter. Feel the weight you carry. Feel its shape, its edges. Now set it down. Leave it here, in the warmth that cannot burn you." Some hesitated. Others obeyed at once, their heads bowing as their eyelids fell shut. Carter remained at the back, half hidden near a post. He watched their breathing slow, their shoulders slacken, as though each word unfastened some invisible binding. Ezekiel spoke not of Scripture alone, but of images, a field bathed in moonlight, a fire whose heat did not harm, a river that carried away memories like driftwood. Minutes blurred. Carter was uncertain whether it had been 10 or 40 when Ezekiel's tone shifted subtly, drawing the congregation back toward wakefulness. When their eyes opened, some were damp with tears, others wore faint, almost dazed smiles. There was relief there, a lightness wholly at odds with the weight of the war, pressing down on the valley. In the days that followed, the stories began. Abigail Price, who had been confined to her bed for months, was seen walking unaided to the creek. Jacob Miller, whose right hand had been useless since shrapnel tore through it, was gripping a plow handle with ease. Children who had grown pale and listless were suddenly laughing again. In the dusty lanes, none of them claimed Ezekiel had cured them outright, but each had attended at least one midnight gathering. Carter noticed subtler changes too. The villagers' speech began to shift. Certain phrases, odd in their construction, slipped into everyday talk. He heard them at the well, in the blacksmith's yard, even in the sick room. "The fire warms but does not burn," or "pain is a sack you can set down." These were Ezekiel's words, repeated with uncanny precision, as if memorized in the marrow. The tone, the pauses, all preserved. When Carter tried to question a few of the townsfolk, their reactions unsettled him more than silence would have. They would smile faintly, listen as though indulging a child, then steer the conversation elsewhere. Always, their eyes seemed to glimmer faintly in the light, not with excitement, but with something more fixed, more permanent. One evening, just before sunset, Carter stepped inside the church. Ezekiel was alone, arranging the oil bowls for the night's gathering. The preacher looked up, and their gazes locked for a moment too long. "Doctor," Ezekiel said evenly, "you look tired. You carry more than you should. It comes with the work," Carter replied, masking his unease. Ezekiel tilted his head, studying him. "Then perhaps you should come tonight. Set your burdens down for a while." Carter gave a polite refusal and left. Yet as he stepped into the cooling air, he felt certain Ezekiel knew that sooner or later he would return. That night, from his window, Carter watched again as the townsfolk made their way toward the dim glow of the church. More of them this time. Their footsteps were soundless on the packed dirt, their faces unreadable in the moonlight. The oil flames flickered faintly through the wall gaps, dancing like a heartbeat in the dark. And though Carter told himself he would not go, more than once his hand hovered over the latch of his door before the hour passed. The midnight gatherings swelled in number, the strange recoveries continued, and while the war raged just beyond the valley, here in Shenandoah Hollow, another battle was being waged, not for the land, nor for the body, but for the mind, and Carter feared the townsfolk had already surrendered. The summer of 1864 had already been cruel, but by mid-July, the Shenandoah Valley seemed cursed. Day after day, the sun beat down with a merciless glare. The hills shimmered in a haze that blurred their outlines, as if the valley itself were melting into a fever dream. The dirt roads cracked into jagged seams, and the air hung heavy with the smell of dust and withering plants. By the second week, entire rows of corn drooped as though bowing to an invisible weight. Cabbage leaves curled and browned at the edges, beans shriveled before ripening. The wells, once cold and brimming, sank inch by inch, and the water that came up carried a faint taste of iron, tempers frayed. The men returning from distant fields argued at the tavern over whose land had been scorched worst. Women snapped at children for tracking dust into the house. Chickens roamed in search of shade, their combs pale and dry. Even the cicadas, ever tireless, seemed to drone with a slower, more labored rhythm. It was into this suffocating unrest that Ezekiel Moore stepped forward, his voice rising above the dust-choked air like a beacon. One sweltering afternoon, he stood before the gathering outside the church, his black coat unbuttoned but his posture still crisp, unbent by the heat. "This," he said, sweeping a hand toward the shimmering horizon, "is not punishment. This is the Lord's refining fire. The silver is only made pure when the dross is burned away. Shall we curse the flame that cleanses us, or shall we walk through it unscorched?" His words threaded through the crowd like cool water, soothing the sting of their thirst, and as if by some unspoken agreement, heads began to nod. Even the farmers who had cursed the weather hours before now stood quiet, eyes fixed on him. But to Carter, the preacher's reframing of their suffering was dangerous. The heat was not divine, it was deadly. The elderly, the sick, and the young were especially vulnerable. His work as a doctor became more urgent each day, yet his patients seemed less inclined to listen. When he advised Sarah Miller to keep her feverish son indoors and well hydrated, she smiled politely but shook her head. "Brother Moore says the heat will drive the sickness out of him. He says water only delays the Lord's work." 2 days later, the boy's fever broke. Sarah credited Ezekiel's prayers. Carter suspected the cool night air had done the work, but the truth no longer seemed to matter. By the 3rd week of the heat wave, Carter was hearing the same phrases repeated across the valley. "The flame cleans. The flame heals. Pain is the dross leaving the soul." Each was spoken with an almost mechanical precision, as though the villagers were reading from some invisible script. One evening, as the sun bled red over the ridge, Carter made a decision. If Ezekiel's midnight gatherings were the source of this growing spell over the town, then he would see them for himself uninvited. And from the shadows, he waited until the streets were empty. Even the dogs lay stretched in the dirt, too tired to bark, moving quickly but silently. He followed the faint thread of footsteps toward the church. But the church was not the final destination this time. The trail led beyond the last fence posts and into the edge of the forest. Carter kept his distance, moving parallel to the thin procession of villagers in the darkness between the pines. A dim glow pulsed ahead, like the heart of some living thing. When he drew close enough to see, his breath caught. The clearing was ringed with small bowls of flame, just as in the church, but here, the bowls were arranged in a perfect circle. In the center stood Ezekiel, coat removed, sleeves rolled, his arms moving in slow, deliberate motions. Round him, the villagers swayed in unison, their bodies rocking back and forth to a rhythm Carter could not hear. Their mouths opened and closed in perfect time, a low chant rising that seemed more felt in the chest than heard by the ears. The words were foreign, or perhaps simply too old to belong to any scripture Carter knew. Yet every voice moved as one, never stumbling, never pausing. Ezekiel moved among them like a conductor, passing his hand over each bowed head, his voice weaving through theirs, sometimes leading, sometimes following. And then Carter noticed it, a faint haze drifting in the air, lit gold by the flames. It curled and twisted in slow spirals, never dispersing, as though reluctant to leave the circle. The scent was faint but sharp. It was the same he had smelled in the church, floral, medicinal, but with something underneath, something acrid and metallic. Carter's mind raced through possibilities. Incense, perhaps, or some herbal mixture meant to induce calm or suggestion. One of the men stumbled slightly, his chant faltering. Ezekiel was beside him in an instant, pressing a hand to his forehead and whispering something too low for Carter to catch. The man straightened immediately, his voice rejoining the others, his sway resuming its perfect rhythm. Carter's heartbeat thundered in his ears. The scene before him was not worship, it was conditioning. The rhythmic chant, the swaying, the enclosed circle, the haze in the air, All of it worked together to erode the individual and strengthen the collective. But then something happened that made Carter's stomach tighten. Ezekiel stopped in the center of the circle and raised both hands. The chanting ceased instantly, as though every tongue had been bound at once. In the silence, he turned his head slowly, and though the firelight did not touch where Carter hid, Ezekiel's eyes seemed to find him all the same. For a long moment, the two men stared across the distance. Then Ezekiel smiled small, knowing, and the chanting resumed. Louder now, rising like heat from the scorched earth. Carter backed away, careful not to break a twig, not to disturb a single leaf. Only when the glow of the clearing had faded behind the pines did he let himself breathe fully again. Yet the scent lingered in his nostrils, and in his mind, the rhythm of the chant refused to fade. Somewhere deep inside, Carter knew he had not merely witnessed the midnight gathering, he had been marked by it. The morning after the midnight gathering, Carter awoke in his rented room with a heaviness that felt more than exhaustion. It was as if the chant he'd heard had followed him into sleep, coiling itself around his dreams and tightening when he tried to stir. He splashed cold water on his face, hoping to wash away the lingering fog. But the rhythm still pulsed faintly in his mind. All morning, the villagers moved about their business with a strange, quiet purpose. Even in the stifling heat, their faces bore the same calm, fixed expressions, like people already certain of something Carter could not see. And woven through their conversations, he heard it again, Ezekiel's words, repeated exactly as though etched into their thoughts. By noon, Carter's decision was made. If Ezekiel's spell over these people was to be broken, it had to start with confronting the man himself. The church stood silent in the afternoon glare, its whitewashed boards reflecting the sun like a signal mirror. Inside, the air was cooler, shaded by warped wooden shutters. Ezekiel sat alone in the front pew, Bible resting on his knee, as if he had been expecting company. When Carter entered, the preacher looked up, not startled, not even curious. Just a slow lift of the eyes, a small smile curling at the edge of his mouth. "Dr. Carter," Ezekiel said, his voice smooth as poured honey. "You've been watching from the shadows. It's time we spoke plainly." Carter didn't sit. "I've seen enough to know what you're doing here. You're using their pain, their grief, their fear to weave yourself into their minds. Whatever you're burning at those gatherings, whatever you're making them repeat, it's not salvation. It's control." Ezekiel closed the Bible gently, letting the leather covers meet with a soft clap. He rose slowly, not in aggression, but with the ease of a man who knows the ground is his. "Control?" He tilted his head. "You call it that. I call it order. In a valley torn apart by war and hunger, I bring stillness. In the fevered minds of widows and orphans, I bring peace." "What do you bring them, doctor?" "Bitter herbs, bandages that rot." In this heat, Carter took a step closer. "I bring truth, and truth doesn't glaze over their eyes or strip them of their will." For a moment, silence filled the church. Then Ezekiel's smile deepened, not warm, not friendly, but something that hinted at the satisfaction of winning a game his opponent didn't even know they were playing. "You're a learned man, Carter, but knowledge without faith is the serpent's tongue, smooth, convincing, and poisoned. You are the serpent in my flock." The words landed with more weight than Carter expected. There was a subtle shift in the air, as if the walls themselves leaned in to listen. When Carter stepped outside, the first thing he noticed was how quickly the street had filled. Men and women stood in small clusters, talking in low voices, their eyes occasionally darting toward him. Some of them people he had treated, even shared meals with, now stared with an unmistakable edge of suspicion. A young man, broad-shouldered and sunburnt, broke from the nearest group. "You ought to keep walking, doctor," he said, his voice flat but carrying. "Brother Moore says you've been sowing lies. I've been trying to keep you alive." Carter replied, "Alive?" The man's lips twitched, almost into a smile. "What's the point of living if your soul's already lost?" From behind him, two more men began to approach. Then a woman stepped forward, her face tight with something between anger and fear. "Leave us be, Carter. You don't belong here." The tone in her voice sent a chill through him, not just hostility, but the finality of a verdict already passed. He backed away slowly, his hands raised in a gesture of peace. I'm not your enemy. But the space between him and the villagers was closing. Their steps were slow, measured, almost like the swaying at the midnight gatherings. Their eyes were fixed, their movements deliberate. Carter's pulse quickened when the broad-shouldered man took another step toward him. Carter turned and ran. The heat pressed in on him as he sprinted down the dirt road toward the livery. Behind him, he heard a few quick footsteps, but they stopped after only a dozen paces. Perhaps the villagers were content to let fear do their work. He saddled his horse with shaking hands, the leather reins slick with sweat. Every instinct told him to leave the valley entirely, but he couldn't. If Ezekiel's influence kept spreading, there would be nothing left of Shenandoah Hollow but obedient shadows of the people it once held. That he knew the sheriff in the nearest town, Samuel Dwyer, a man who had weathered the war with his sense of duty intact. If anyone could help him bring Ezekiel's activities into the light, it would be Dwyer. By the time Carter reached the sheriff's office in the next town, the sun had dropped low, painting the valley in a dull bronze glow. Dwyer listened without interrupting, leaning back in his chair, his weathered hands steepled. "You're telling me," he said finally, "that a preacher's got half your town under some kind of spell?" "I'm telling you he's using more than just words. There's something in the air at those meetings, something that makes people pliable, suggestible. They're repeating his phrases in their daily lives like scripture. And now they're turning against anyone he marks as an outsider." Dwyer scratched at his jaw, his eyes narrowing. "Sounds like you're talking about a cult." "I'm talking about something dangerous," Carter said, leaning forward. "And if we wait any longer, it'll be too late to pull them back." They rode hard under the cover of night, arriving in Shenandoah Hollow just past midnight. The church loomed ahead, its silhouette stark against the pale wash of moonlight. Carter dismounted, heart pounding not with fear now, but with a grim anticipation. He pushed the door open. It creaked once and swung wide. Inside, the pews were empty. The pulpit stood bare. The faint scent of smoke hung in the air, but it was cold hours old. Dwyer stepped in behind him, scanning the shadows. "You sure they meet here?" "They did," Carter said. His voice felt too loud in the hollow space. But now, he moved down the aisle, his footsteps echoing. On the floor near the pulpit, he saw faint, curved marks, impressions in the dust where the fire bowls had once stood. "They've gone," he murmured. Dwyer's voice was low. "Gone where?" Carter didn't answer. His eyes were drawn to the front wall, where a single scrap of parchment had been nailed. The handwriting was neat, deliberate, unmistakably Ezekiel's. "The flame moves on. Those who seek it must follow." The words sat heavy in Carter's mind, and in them he could almost hear the preacher's voice. Calm and unyielding, wherever they had gone, the flock was still intact, and their shepherd was leading them deeper into the fire. The dawn broke dull and heavy over Shenandoah Hollow, the heat already rising like steam from a forge. Carter and Sheriff Dwyer stood at the church's front steps, gazing down the dirt road where the preacher's flock had vanished. The valley felt wrong, emptier than it should, yet not at peace. It was Dwyer who found the first clue, a cluster of shallow boot prints in the dust behind the church, all pointing toward the tree line. Carter crouched, brushing the dry earth with his fingertips. The prints were fresh, pressed deep by many feet moving together in the same direction. "They're on foot," Dwyer muttered, "and moving slow. We can follow them." The two men saddled their horses and rode to the edge of the woods. The tracks led into the shade of towering oaks and hickories, their leaves hanging limp in the breathless summer air. At first, the trail was easy, trampled underbrush, broken branches, scraps of cloth snagged on brambles. But as they went deeper into Shenandoah Hollow, the air began to change, denser, warmer, with a faint scent of something burned long ago. The forest itself seemed to narrow around them. No birds called, no wind stirred the leaves, only the soft thud of hooves and the occasional snap of a twig beneath their boots broke the silence. After nearly an hour, they dismounted. The tracks had turned into a narrow deer path that wound uphill. Moving on foot, they climbed until the trees began to thin, revealing a small clearing on the ridge. Carter stopped short. The ground here was scorched black in uneven patches, as though small fires had been lit and snuffed in strange, deliberate patterns. Around the clearing stood crude wooden crosses, each one different, some tall and straight, others crooked, nailed together from mismatched planks. At the base of several crosses lay personal items: a child's toy soldier, afraid, bonnet, a tarnished pocket watch. Every piece looked placed with care, not discarded, as if marking where someone had stood or perhaps knelt. Dwyer walked to one of the scorched patches and crouched, rubbing ash between his fingers. "This wasn't from a wildfire," he said. "To controlled. Someone built these fires right where they wanted them." Carter's gaze drifted to the center of the clearing. There, the earth was bare and smooth, the dirt stamped flat as though many feet had circled it again and again. It was then that they heard a faint rustling from the tree line opposite, where they'd entered. Both men turned, hands on their weapons. A figure emerged slowly from the shadows. He was barefoot, his shirt hanging in tatters from his bony frame. His eyes were wide but unfocused, and his lips moved in a ceaseless whisper. Dwyer stepped forward. "Easy, son, you hurt." The man didn't seem to hear. His feet shuffled over the scorched ground, and he stopped at the center of the clearing. Swaying gently, his whispering grew louder, just enough for them to make out the words, "We're in the fire now, and it's beautiful." Carter's stomach tightened. "Where's the rest of them? Where's Ezekiel Moore?" The man's gaze finally flicked toward him, but there was no recognition in it, only the same distant rapture Carter had seen in the villagers' eyes before. "They're gone," the man said softly. "We all stepped in together. The fire took us, and it will take you too, if you listen." Then he began to laugh, not wildly, but with a strange, fragile joy that made the hairs on Carter's arms rise. Dwyer moved to restrain him, but the man didn't resist. His limbs hung loose, his eyes never leaving the empty space at the clearing's heart. Carter searched the perimeter for more tracks, but every sign seemed to fade beyond this point, as if the group had been swallowed whole by the forest. The sheriff's voice was low. "It's like they just vanished." Carter glanced at the survivor, if survivor was the right word, and felt the pull of something. He couldn't explain. The center of the clearing seemed to hum in the heat, the air wavering like it does over sun-baked roads. He forced himself to turn away. "We need to get him out of here, and then we burn it." But as they led the man back toward the path, Carter couldn't shake the feeling that they hadn't truly found the end of Ezekiel Moore's trail. Days later, after the sheriff had questioned the man and found him incapable of giving any clear account, Carter prepared to leave Shenandoah Hollow. The townsfolk who remained were cautious, but no longer openly hostile. Still, the valley felt thinner somehow, as if part of it had been cut away. On his last night, Carter stood at the edge of the woods where the tracks had begun. The sun had gone down, and the air was heavy with the smell of dry earth. He listened at first to nothing but his own breathing. Then, faintly, he heard it, a slow, rhythmic murmur, so soft it might have been the wind. But it wasn't the wind. The cadence was too even, the tone too human. It came from deep within the hollow, rolling through the trees, like an echo from a gathering long past. He couldn't make out the words, but the sound stirred the memory of that night in the church, the glazed eyes, the swaying bodies, the firelight bending in strange rhythms. Carter turned away, mounting his horse without looking back. Behind him, the murmurs faded into the summer night, but the hollow remained patient and watchful, waiting for another season of heat to open its mouth and breathe again. ********.